Hello, and welcome to The Reading Room, the podcast brought to you by your Rowan County Public Library. I'm Morgan.
I'm Atlanta.
I'm Emery.
And today we welcome our new co-host. Megan, unfortunately, is unable to continue with us at this time, and so we are super pleased to welcome Atlanta to the show. Hello.
Hello.
Yay, Atlanta. And it will be just as much fun because Atlanta is deep into like a lot of our programming and helps with that. She does the staff picks and she does the blog, which if you are not reading, why not?
Why not?
It's so fun.
It's free. Everything we do is free. And
providing you with more free reading material.
There you go. Exactly. So I know we mentioned staff picks on the podcast before, and I think I even said at the time that you would have a more intuitive knowledge than I would, because I was like, I know my staff picks, but I don't know what everybody else chose. So we are still currently, at least through the end of this month, on the same round of staff picks that have been out there for a little while, where the theme was motivation, right?
Yes. We're changing them quarterly right now. So they've been out there for 2 months and we'll finish them out this month. The buzzword that the staff used was motivation. So when we chose our staff picks, hopefully we kept that word in mind. And they kind of go every which way. Like some of them are motivation for working out. Some of them are motivation for mindfulness. I think it's really interesting to see where the staff take that.
Yeah, no, me too, because I know that I kind of went in several directions with my picks, because I chose like a cookbook, but then also like the Dungeons and Dragons rule book, and then also I think that there was like an anti-bullying book. Everybody kind of interprets motivation differently, which is evident after so long spent quarantining and like dealing with the pandemic and stuff like that. I know motivation can be hard to find, so there are some good books out there on that shelf, and if you need a little motivation, you should definitely come and check them out, figuratively and literally. So what's our upcoming thing? Because you said we're going to be changing at the end of this month, so beginning of October we'll have a new crop.
I'm actually really excited about the coming crop because in October we're going to switch over to sweet and sour being our buzzwords. And that's going to change a little bit in December. We can talk more about that another time because it's a special surprise.
Ooh.
But sweet and sour, we're going to have 2 buzzwords this time, and we get to choose what that means to us and what items kind of inspire that.
Yes, I've been thinking about that ever since you announced it, and I was like, sweet and sour. And of course, the first thing I think of is like food, like candy. But also there's so much more to it than that, because like I mentioned, the pandemic, and I mean, there's been so much sour going on. There's been so much bad, but you kind of have to take the little victories where you get them, and they're all the sweeter because of the contrast. So I'm going to be really interested to see what some people pick. Do you have any already in mind that we can look forward to?
I have not thought about mine because I think that I'm kind of going the same way where like everything's been sour, so what do we have to sweeten it up? And I think I'm taking it a little too seriously. But so far some people have picked out cookbooks, kind of like you said, and sweet and sour kind of went 2 different ways. There are, I think, rum cakes and then like a book of different whiskey sweets. So sweet and sour. I thought that was very interesting.
No, that actually, okay. Yeah.
I think that I may be wrong, but I feel like I saw a pickling book.
There absolutely was a pickling book. 2. There are 2 pickling books. One is sweet and one is sour, so there's that to look forward to.
And I know that somebody, I think maybe Kaya was going with happy and sad endings.
That's
Ooh.
Genius. Yeah. I love that.
No, that's pretty good, actually, because like I said, my thoughts immediately turned to food, and also 'tis the season, because October is when the holidays start, for better or for worse this year. So, we have Candy Day at the end of that month, followed immediately then by Turkey Day, and then, again, by all of the other holidays in December, and then New Year's, which of course is a partying and drinking holiday. It's hard for me to not think about food, and that's why I haven't submitted mine yet. Is I've been trying to think of like, what can I do that's not food, because that's the obvious pick. Right. So like you, I think I'm taking it a little too seriously.
I think I am too, but we'll get there.
But yeah, we'll get there, and I'll be really interested to see who does what. because the picks that are out there now, I think were a bountiful harvest. There was a lot of diversity, and I mean, everybody reads something different, and it's nice to see what winds up on the shelf, not just that's picked by staff, but also to see what's circulating and to see what, patrons, what you all who are listening check out from our selections as well, because these are books that we're recommending for you to read. Presumably, we have read them ourselves. I know that I had read mine. I know that that's probably not always universal. It doesn't have to be, but that means that there's a grain of selfishness in that, because it's like, I want to see who read mine. Like, how many times were my books checked out? How many times were your books checked out?
Absolutely.
There's something so exciting about a patron bringing up a book that has been on the shelf for a long time, but like I know I haven't seen anybody check it out in a while, and it's one of my favorite books. And then they bring it up from the staff picks shelf, and like it gets checked out again and again, and you're like, I love this.
It's almost like I recommended that to you. Like, you don't even know that I did it, but I recommended it.
It's very small personal victories that add up.
Yeah, well, because I mean, we're always pleased to see people using the library full stop. We're always glad to see people in, and however you use it, we're always happy with that, whether that is checking out materials, whether that is just here for programs, if you're just using the computers or whatever. But there is something, like, it's a special part of the job, I think, giving reading recommendations. And staff picks are kind of like that, but reading recommendations are personalized. When someone comes up to the desk and says, I'm looking for X, do you have any suggestions? And it's great to be able to say, sure, I just got through reading this, or so-and-so told me you should give this a try. But I think that staff picks are kind of like that experience, but for the whole community.
Yeah,
because then
absolutely.
you're setting things out. It's like any of the other displays that we do, especially when Jess puts something together, like for music, or the gardening display was really popular. It's the whole community should be interested in this. We're recommending that everyone read this and check this out. So whenever I see a book come off of one of those shelves, it's always, yes, we're doing it right. We're bringing the right stuff to the forefront and making sure that it gets in people's eyes, because we just have so many books. I think sometimes they get lost in the shuffle.
Yeah.
That's why we cannot encourage y'all enough to use the search in our catalog to find what you're looking for, because we have so much stuff that you could browse for a long time and just not find things, and we may have exactly what you want and we might not even know because the catalog is so big. But it's there. And if it's not there, we'll get it. We've been over that. Interlibrary loan, we talked about that at length last time, I think.
Yeah, we did.
Interlibrary loan is magical. So I think here recently, one of the things that you have been doing as the staff picks have rolled on is also actually kind of concerning the catalog. Like, one of the problems we've had is we've got a shelf for new and best-selling materials. And it's right there at the front when you come in, you get to see it. But there is also not always, there's not just a notification that goes out to people saying, hey, these are the new books that we've gotten. And we've had some, requests for that in the past. And sometimes we can do things like, we have the ability to show new DVDs, for example, that have been added to the collection. If you go to the catalog, that's one of the first things that you see kind of across the top. But when we get a new or best-selling item in and it is on that shelf, it has historically just kind of been put there, and we haven't really told anybody. It doesn't go out in a newsletter or anything like that. And you've been changing that. The signs out there that say, here's what we've added, here's what's on the shelf.
Oh, yes, that's absolutely true. I actually have recently started a weekly bestseller list. There's a sign at the edge of the bestseller shelf that's going to change every week for what new things that we have brought in, rather than it just being there. And actually, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I've been thinking for a while that it would be interesting to put the bestsellers out onto the blog as well, because they are just kind of on the shelf and aren't mentioned as much once they're out there.
Yeah, because the bestsellers, I think, suffer from that, where there's an assumption that everybody knows, that's why they're bestsellers, which is not actually the case. So we get these items in the expectation that they're just going to see a bazillion checkouts. And the fact is that not everybody actually knows about them, and plenty of people who come in, this is the first time that they're seeing these books and these playaways and these DVDs and whatever. So you are going to have the best notion of what's out there, I think, for the most part. So definitely go and give the blog a read. If you are not already reading it, check it out. There is a link on our website under the About page or under the About section of the menu. And that updates at the first of every month. So you can see what Atlanta has been up to. And she's been doing book lists and reading recommendations for like not just new and incoming items and things like that, but also thematically for, as the season rolls on. Like you did one that was kind of back to school.
Yeah, and August was back to school. I think for September I did books with older characters because Grandparents' Day falls in September.
Yeah.
And I do recommendations for young readers and then also young adult and adult. So you get 5 recommendations for each age group, and it kind of goes along with a theme. And for October, I'm going to have a nice, fun, spooky theme. So hopefully there will be something interesting there for you then.
I'm so glad that it's like there's only 15 days till Halloween. As of the time of this recording.
We've been in Halloween for 16 days. If you're listening to this, comment somewhere and tell Morgan that Halloween starts September 1st.
That is very true. I agree.
I'm very much one of those, like, on November 1st, it's like 364 days.
Yes. Gotta start planning next year's Halloween.
There we go. That's the big one for me. And COVID has made that rough. Last year, I know that here in town, they did not call trick or treat off, and they tried to have like the official kids trick or treat night and do it as safely as possible. But it was really strange and appropriately for Halloween, very eerie to go home and sit and see everyone with their porch lights off and not have people come around and knock on your door expecting candy because everyone was just kind of sitting at home. And I don't know what's going to happen this year because, of course, things are getting rough again. But they've been rough. So that means that we're going to try and do as much as we can to help get you through the holiday season. So definitely come by, keep an eye out, and check the blog for that spooky theme and those reading recommendations, because we do have some Halloween ideas. And even if we're not able to bring programming back in October the way that we hope, then we will still be able to do something Halloween-y. I definitely I'm sure of that. Probably we will bring back grave sites. That was a lot of fun last year.
Yeah, I had forgotten about that.
That was a lot of fun last year, and I'll make an announcement about that on like social media and stuff. And Atlanta, I don't think you actually got to participate last year.
I don't think I know what that is.
Emery did. So what we did was we asked patrons to submit their spookiest stories, either local legends that are actually from here in Morehead and Rowan County, or original stories. We had a couple of those. And then we had staff members read and record them and posted the recordings to the website where everybody could go and listen to them.
Wow.
Yeah, and that was a big hit. I still have the original ones. I think the page might still be there, and I'll just add the new stories to the ones that are already there. I'm looking forward to that because I definitely want to get some folks involved who didn't get a chance to do that last year. So like you, and we have some new folks, some of the people who didn't already participate last round. So yeah, if you're listening to this, go ahead. You don't have to wait. Hit us up and email us at email@rowancountylibrary.org and send us your spookiest story, or if you have a local myth or legend that is kind of spooky or scary that has been passed down, or it's a folk tale that took place here in Morehead or Rowan County, send it to us. And if yours gets chosen, then one of us will narrate it, and we will record that and post it in October for everyone to listen to. And of course, make sure that your name and stuff is on there, and that way we can credit you if you want credited. And if not, that's also fine. If you would like to remain anonymous, that is also perfectly fine. So speaking of the blog and your themes, you mentioned that you had broken it down, and of course, and I've seen this when I've read your entries to young readers, young adult, and adult. And I actually, because Emery and I have talked about this a little bit before, how do you decide what goes in each recommendation category. Is it just straight up like E and J books go in kids and then YA only for young adult, or because sometimes those lines are blurry.
Sometimes the lines are blurry. I think that luckily with the blog, I've allowed myself a little bit more creative liberty there. There are some that I pop into young readers even though they're in our YA section, or vice versa. The ALA recommends that it goes based off of the main character's age, but there are just so many times where you've got a 6-year-old going through something horrific. And that's something that I would definitely recommend to young adult readers, more likely on the blog than a young reader. Young reader is hopefully going to be hopefully any kids, but really up to the age of like 12 or 13, I'm including those in young readers.
Right, because I mean, that is, like we said, there's a lot of gray areas. You and I have discussed this.
Yeah, we've definitely talked about it before.
Where, like, a lot of YA literature, especially, I think gets put in that category because people are breaking new ground, and what we consider to be adult literature is kind of become traditional. It's people have gotten into a rut, and there's a formula to it a lot of times, and there are certain big name authors, and new authors often tend to imitate what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I know you have recommended a lot of YA literature to me that I read and was like, this was not written for a 13-year-old. Like, this, someone put the YA sticker on this
Exactly.
because like they didn't know what to do with it, but this was not written for teenagers.
And it is, like Atlanta said, it's based on the main character's age more often than not. So like you end up with teenagers in these scenarios that, like, very clearly some of the books that are categorized as YA, well, in my opinion, very clearly were written for an adult audience. I was reading something and I can't remember now what it was even, but it was a YA novel, and I was reading it out loud to my husband, and he stopped me and said, "Whoa, are they allowed to say that?" And I can't remember, of course, what it was, but he said, "Are they allowed to say that in a young adult novel?" And that was funny to me because it felt like, I think that people who don't work around or with literature a lot and don't know quite as much about classifications based on like age group kind of look at it as TV or movie ratings.
Right. That's literally what I was just thinking in my head, is like the difference between PG-13 and rated R.
Right, exactly.
And like there's a lot of things that slip under the radar for PG-13 where you're kind of like, should they have made that joke if it's actually PG-13?
Yeah, exactly.
And also I've seen some rated R movies where I was like,
for what?
For what? Yeah, like why really? And sometimes I know that there is a rubric by which that stuff is judged, but at the same time, there definitely is some crossover, and that happens a lot in books because I mean, if you go by the age of the protagonist, there are definitely children and teenagers who are main characters in, for example, I don't know, Game of Thrones.
Mm-hmm.
And I would not consider that YA literature.
Absolutely not. I think one of the biggest examples of this for me in Atlanta, I know that we've talked about this before because we do have a copy of it categorized as young adult, and another copy categorized as adult fiction is Room by Emma Donoghue.
It is a very tough subject, that one. I'm not sure why any child would ever read that, but it is a story told from the perspective of a young boy. I think he's 5 turning 6, but it's from his perspective, him and his mother being locked in a dungeon by a kidnapper. So, like, it's not for the faint of heart, and I certainly wouldn't want an 8-year-old reading it or finding it on the shelves, but since it's based on the main character's age, we've got it in 2 different sections.
And I've seen that happen a couple of other times too. Like I know for a fact that we have some Nicholas Sparks that is in both YA and A, and it's not just divided up by book, but we'll have the same title in both places and I don't know for sure that this is one of them, but something like A Walk to Remember or Nights in Rodanthe or The Notebook or whatever, it will be in both of those shelves. It will be in YA and adult literature. And I mean, that is where it gets fuzzy because sometimes like it might be a really tame story that still deals with adult themes, or you might have, like you suggested, a really violent or dark story or a really gritty story or a horror story where the main character just happens to be 6 or 8 or 12, and it goes in that section. And I know that there's a lot of conversation about that. There are some things like if you've read Coraline by Neil Gaiman,
Mhm.
then the protagonist in there, she is something like 13 or 14 or 12 or whatever. But it is also very much a horror story, and it is a Neil Gaiman horror story. And having read it, I think that it's appropriate that it goes in the YA section. But it also is a good example of how someone could flip through that and be like, this is about a teenager, but like this gets rough in places. This is, this
we
hits
don't
I
hard.
think it's in juvenile.
It's in juvenile. I
Is
was
it?
just gonna say.
Oh, see, then that's the other end of it. Is it's the same problem but different part of the spectrum.
Mhm.
Because if that's a J book, I just automatically assumed that it was YA. See,
Right.
I think it's interesting because it's not so much, the parameters aren't so much about content the way that we're used to, like in film ratings, because literature reflects life and everybody experiences the same lives kind of. We're on the same planet, but everyone experiences life differently. So I think the reason it's based on that age is because so many people can be experiencing the same thing at the same time, but the perspective we're hearing it from is this person's perspective. And they are this age. Like Harry Potter actually splits halfway through the series. The first half of the series is in juvenile, and the second half is in young adult because Harry is growing and the content of the book does change. But of course, bad things happen in the first book just as badly as bad things happen in the sixth or seventh.
right, and it deals with a lot of the same mature themes the entire time, like toxic relationships and bad families and lies and
Absolutely.
secrets and things like that, and the political intrigue. But you do see, regardless of how you feel about that author, the series is a great example of how he starts at the age of 10 or 11, and he is still being exposed to and evolved in, or involved in the same events as he is when the character has reached the age of 18, because I remember reading those and having the character kind of like grow along with me as a
Right.
reader, and a lot of people do. And you can see that there is some gray area there. There is some blurry territory, but there is also a clear cutoff where, like, okay, this just got like a lot
Darker,
grittier.
a lot. Yeah.
And I think that part of that is because the character's perspective on it changes, like what you were pointing out, because he starts with the perspective of a child, and then as he grows, he gains the perspective of a teenager and eventually of a young adult. So it's an interesting conversation to have, because I'm never sure. And you made a good point that like literature reflects our lives, and I think that film does also, but film is different because film is visual, for one thing, like it's a different medium. And so you can't really say to someone who's writing a book or who's reading a book, you can't show this on screen, because that's part of the perspective question. When I read something, I might visualize it differently than you do. But in a film, everyone's getting the same visual component. They're seeing the same thing, regardless of how they interpret it. So it's easier to make clear-cut rules where they say, okay, no, this has nudity in it, so it must be rated R. It cannot be rated PG-13. And we all just, even if there's an ongoing conversation about how much and what kind of nudity is acceptable, at the same time, we also all agree that certain kinds of nudity, whatever that is deemed unacceptable at the time, goes on this side of the line. And we
Right.
can visually demonstrate what that is. And in a book, you just don't have that power.
I think film is very beautiful, but it's very measurable. There's only so much
Yeah.
content. So if a certain amount of that content crosses a line, then the rating just gets knocked up. It gets a little bit higher. And with books, there's nuances. There's so many levels
Mhm.
that like we can't really measure the content. Sure, this pushes a line, but how much of the book pushes a line?
Right. Because
So I
even
think
if it's
that
just
has something to do with it.
Yeah, because even if it's just what you're seeing in your head, it's like, I think that we might have talked about this before. We discussed things like The Lord of the Rings and how
Mhm.
you had not read it, but like because you've seen the movies, that's what Gandalf looks like to you. That's what Frodo looks like to you. And I said at the time, my dad was reluctant to watch the movies for a long time for a similar reason. It's because he's such a super fan of the books. He was afraid watching the movie would put someone else's vision of the scenes and the characters and the actions and the dialogue and all of that, even the delivery, in his head, and might influence how he had always interpreted the story. And I think that that's valid to a point, in that, again, with film, like you said, it's measurable. We're all seeing the same thing. An actor's giving a performance. But when we read a book, the actors are us. So we are getting what someone has written down, but that perspective of the reader is important. And I'm going to imagine like what someone looks like or how they sound a little bit differently from you or from anyone else. And so it's a lot harder to just kind of put your hands on either side of a section of content in a book and be like, yeah, no, this definitely is for teens, or this is for children, this is for adults only.
There's so much power given to the reader. You kind of get to choose your own experience. And I agree with you, like the audience of a film, we're all going to see the same thing. You can choose how it makes you feel, but we're all looking at the same stuff.
Yeah. So it really is, like, that's the magic of a book, but that also is what makes it difficult on our end is, okay, if the age of the protagonist, this person is 8, it goes in juvenile, like, but does it? But does it though? I think another really great example of that is that graphic novel, Something is Killing the Children.
Oh my gosh.
That is an adult for a reason. And the main character is a fairly young woman. Like, she's probably the one who's the actual protagonist is probably in her 20s.
Yeah.
And is therefore an adult, but
she's taking care of their.
Yeah, like there are children
kids,
in it.
Yeah.
There are numerous children, and they are main characters. And we get their perspective on these events. And they are traumatizing events, and they are awful events, and they are graphically depicted. So,
but that's the thing, though. They're graphically depicted.
Yeah, even then, it's a graphic novel. So someone looked at that and said, "Oh, no. This goes in the adult graphic novel section, not the YA or the J graphic novel section," because someone sat down and very meticulously drew out all of this gore and all of this violence and whatever. And if there was a novel or a novelization of that comic series,
who knows what?
Who knows? It might be listed as YA because the protagonist is fairly young and there are a lot of children in there, and it's a story about children. And if I saw that in the YA section, having read the graphic novel, I would be confused. But it's because I've read the graphic novel.
Because you've seen it.
Because I've seen it. I know what they're trying to depict.
Yeah.
And it is very different in writing. So yeah, I'm always interested in how other people kind of categorize those things, because we technically have a rubric. We have a metric for that. But it's an ongoing conversation for a reason.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's also why I think all of us probably read a lot of YA too.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, I know that I do, and I know that a lot of our circulation staff does, for sure. We've all read a lot of the same things, and a lot of them fall under the YA category.
Yeah, including graphic novels.
Yeah, absolutely.
Including just, regular novels as well, written literature, because there's a lot of fresh stories in YA, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I talk a lot about how I feel like, from a personal standpoint, nobody at me, but I feel like a lot of times adult authors don't care quite as much about their characters, and especially about their characters' development overall. I don't know if it's because I am a writer and because I care so much about my own characters. I have a hard time reading anything that I feel like not enough attention has been paid to developing these whole people.
Right. No, I can see that. A complaint that I have made about some books I've read in the past is that the adventure, whatever it is, whether it's a thriller or a horror novel or fantasy or sci-fi or whatever, Western, is happening to this person or at this person, but it could have happened to anyone. If this was not, John Smith, it could have just as easily been Joe Smith or it could have been Jane Doe, and nothing about the story would really have changed because we're
Yes.
given a fully formed character, and it's not about their development, it's about how they as a complete character are reacting to what's happening to them. So it feels like the author is throwing stuff at them to make things happen. And it feels a little impersonal and a little formulaic, whereas in a lot of YA stuff that I read, I feel as though there really is a more personal element that even if the protagonist is not meant to be a stand-in for or an outgrowth of the author as a person themselves, the author spent a lot more time agonizing over what does this do to them? How do they react to this? How does this change them in the next chapter? And what does that mean for the end of my book?
I think a young adult author pays a lot more attention to their audience. I don't know if it's making it more accessible, but I think a young adult author stops and takes the time to answer for themselves, like, how will people take this? Am I being clear? Is this exactly how this would go down? Whereas I think adult authors think that they know their audience already. They think that their audience is basically them as a reader. And I think young adult authors notice that a lot of people are reading.
Yeah.
And it's not just one opinion.
No, I think that that's actually a really good way to put it because that's also something I see in the way that materials circulate. Like, you'll have folks who come in and they really like a specific author, and they'll come in and they ask for, do you have anything else like this? Does she have any more books? No? Okay, well, can you recommend another author like her? Like, people who love Janet Ivanovich, they want to read more stuff by Janet Ivanovich. People who love William Johnstone, they want to read more stuff like
Very
William
true.
Johnstone. And that's true for a lot of best-selling authors. That's true for Tom Clancy, Dean Koontz. That is even true for Stephen King, although Stephen King to me has a much more widely varied protagonists and stories, and he often spends a lot more time in their heads. But then you have to consider he's a horror author. And more than that, he's the king of atmospheric horror, which means he has to take you into that character's head.
Oh, absolutely.
But if you are reading, a Western, or you're reading a contemporary thriller, or you're reading an urban romance, you don't necessarily have to, which is why I said before, like, formulaic. But in YA, you don't see that as much. You see people reading a lot more diverse stories, and I think that's kind of a problem. Not that there are diverse stories, but rather that a lot of diverse stories like capital D with the TM at the end get pushed into YA because that's sort of the environment of adult literature.
Oh, sure.
So if there is diversity, then people go, oh, this was written for teenagers, or this was written for college students.
Very true.
Which is a guise for this is written for the people who won't be offended by it.
Kind of, and in the same way that adult literature is often seen as this is written for an existing audience. But with YA, you don't always know who your audience is. Anyone could pick up that book because kids are curious. Adults are often seen as not. We're told what we like, or it's assumed that we know what we like. I'm going to write this book and put it out there, and someone will read it or they won't.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the people who want this story will find this story and they will read it. But with a YA author, they're kind of what Atlanta said. They're appealing to everyone. They're trying to make a universal story or make it universally accessible. And one of the outgrowths of that you can often see is they spend more time with their characters, and they spend more time, I think, investigating and talking about how their characters react to things and how it makes them feel, because they want to touch that part of you when you're reading it.
Yes, absolutely.
It's interesting because there are still authors that are just as well established as, like, the James Patterson of the adult world. There are young adult authors that are still just as well established. They do have an audience.
Oh, yeah.
And they could know their audience, but they still write a variety of different things. Rainbow Rowell comes to mind.
Yes.
She has written like 6 or 7 different books that were just so different, but so beautifully written. Meg Cabot knows her audience. She wrote the Princess Diaries, but she steps out of the Princess Diaries audience so many times and is just as successful. But once you cross into her adult novels, they don't pick up as much. And I think that that's just something about that young adult genre.
I think another one that comes to mind is Shannon Mcguire.
Oh
Yes.
my gosh, yes,
Because,
absolutely.
and actually, she's one of those authors that her books read like what would normally be classified as YA
She
based on this
actually-
discussion, but she's actually in our adult section.
She does have some literature that is classified as YA
Mhm.
and some that isn't. And in my opinion, it all reads the same way. She is the exception. Well, there are a few,
Exactly.
but she's one of the largest exceptions, in my opinion, to the adult fiction authors don't care about their characters.
Right, because she has
She
books like
really
Every
does.
Heart a Doorway, and that whole series, that is in the adult section.
Yes.
But it reads like a YA novel because of the way that we often classify YA material. And then if you go and read her actual YA material, you can tell she wrote it, and the only difference is the adventure that the characters are having.
Yep.
And it's like, see, that's what I want from
It's
all
one
my
of those
authors.
very few situations where the context is the deciding factor.
Exactly. And it's the context is clearer there as well. Like I think that you can look at that and you can draw that line that this goes in YA and this goes in adult for her as an author.
Mhm.
But I'm also like, I have to step back and be impressed that someone did classify her adult stuff as adult, just because I look at it and I feel like it reads as adult to me, but it also reads to me like a lot of stuff that is in YA that maybe shouldn't be there, or that maybe is questionable being classified as YA.
Yes.
So it's like, what was the line? Where, at what point during this series did someone read this and go, "Oh, okay, no, I see what she's getting at. No, okay, this is meant for adults." And that's an interesting question because a lot of people are going to have a different answer. And context always matters, which is a great segue into something that we should have talked about last time, and I definitely want to talk about this time. I know we're all excited about it, and that is Banned Books Week, which starts at the end of this month, begins September 26th, and runs through October 2nd. And Banned Books Week is our celebration of the fight against censorship. Because as librarians, we, I think, can all say that there are things on our shelves that personally or professionally or morally or whatever, we wish were not there.
Sure.
Or that we don't want to see, that we don't want to read them and be exposed to them. But that's not what it's about. It is about freedom of information. It is about access to information and self-education. Yeah, we have some books that were written by some really awful people about really awful stuff, and I don't like, to the point where I don't think it's political to say that it's a bad book by a bad person. But you can't judge someone, just like you can't judge a book by its cover, as we've joked before. You can't judge someone for what they're checking out, because maybe someone's writing a history report for their college or high school class about why this person was awful and why this book is awful, and you have to reference the book to do that.
Right, exactly.
You're going to have to quote the book, and you're going to have to credit the author, because that's what you do when you are being academically appropriate. So, it's about making stuff available, because we all know the saying that if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it.
Exactly.
So you have to keep the bad stuff on the shelves to remember that, like, that happened. And that's why we put everything out there. And so libraries, it's very important to us that we do fight against censorship, that we do fight in favor of freedom of information, especially because too often we all know that when something is censored, it is just because it made someone uncomfortable and not because it is genuinely bad.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Too often something is found objectionable because someone didn't like the thoughts that it made them have, or they were afraid that it was going to, change something that someone else thought in a way that they didn't like. And so because of that, we celebrate Banned Books Week every year, and we celebrate the triumphs against censorship, where we as librarians and professionals and other people in the academic world and in the art world and people like you have stood up and said, no, that book does go on that shelf. You're not going to stop me from reading this. You're not going to stop me from watching this. You're not going to stop me from playing this video game or from listening to this audiobook, because I should be allowed to engage that how I choose to do so. And it's weird to think that even in 2021, books are still being challenged. And in some places, occasionally, books are still being banned from a community, or if maybe not from a public library like ours, they might be banned from a school library, because angry parents came in and said, I don't want my child reading that. I don't want it to influence them in such and such a way.
Yes.
And the fact that we can fight back against that and that we have so many more of those types of materials that we have gotten back onto the shelves or that we've been able to defend and keep them there than that aren't there is really something that is worth celebrating. So we definitely invite you to celebrate it with us by coming and checking stuff out from our banned books display, which we have put together with a pretty diverse crop.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know there's some classics on there, but there's a lot of books on the banned books list that you might be surprised to find them there.
It is very interesting. Things that you might think of as a pillar of literature or things that you read just a couple of years ago. It's very surprising to find out what has been challenged and what has been banned in other places. Twilight by Stephanie Meyer has been heavily challenged. And the Harry Potter series again, but
of course
it's worth a mention.
Mm-hmm.
The Wizard of Oz has been challenged and banned widely.
That was one
very
that
interesting to see.
That was one that I was very surprised to find out because I think, like you said, pillars of literature. Like this is part of the literary canon. You take for granted that this book has just always been on the shelf for you and has always been available to you. And then when you find out that 50 years previous someone challenged it, it feels weird because you're like, why? Like reading it as an 8-year-old, you're like, I don't see the problem with this. So like, what were my grandparents thinking? Like, what was their deal? And like, it's the time delay where when something has been the way it is for a very long time, it gains an inertia, it gains a momentum of its own, where you just kind of take it for granted, like I said, that it's always been that way.
Sure.
So it's surprising to go back. And it's more obvious, like The Great Gatsby. The Catcher in the Rye, of course, big classic, and The Catcher in the Rye is one of the most challenged books. It's a big one. The Grapes of Wrath, To Kill a Mockingbird, The Color Purple, of course, and that one...
Shocking.
Right, and like, I get why people challenge The Color Purple. I don't agree with it, but I understand why. But you look at, like, Ulysses by James Joyce. People in the United States, like in the World War I era, were burning that book. Why? Like, it's Ulysses versus, like, Beloved by Toni Morrison. I get why some people would find that objectionable. Again, I don't agree. But I see the line. I see the process. And then, like, Lord of the Flies, 1984. Lolita.
Read those in high school.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, even if you look at a book like Lolita, and it's widely misunderstood and misinterpreted to its detriment and to all our detriment, but like these are books that we just read in high school, and we have always had access to them. And it's weird to go back and think, wow, somebody put a lot of effort and energy into fighting to make sure that we couldn't do that.
Yeah, I've got to say, one of my personal favorites is the downright sacrilege of the speaking animals in Charlotte's Web.
Yeah. That really, yeah. And that's the reason.
It is. No, it actually is. That is
the reason.
The first time that I ever heard that Charlotte's Web had been banned, and I don't remember where even. But I was so surprised that I immediately had to Google, like, why? Like, it's Charlotte's Web. Every child I've ever met in my life, no matter if it's somebody that was, like, born at the same time as me or 5 years ago, every kid has read Charlotte's Web. I was like, what do you mean? Like, why? And it was because speaking animals, sacrilegious.
Yeah, versus, like, Animal Farm.
That was the one I was going to mention. Animal Farm has been challenged for both being anti-Christian and too Christian. So we don't really know where the line is.
Yeah, and similarly, there are books like Sophie's Choice, which is about like the suffering of a Holocaust survivor. And it has been challenged numerous times. And often the reasoning is just because it deals with mental illness. And it's so graphic about like her experiences and things, and you kind of get the feeling of for a lot of banned books, for a lot of challenged books, it very much kind of feels like just we don't want to talk about this.
Right.
we just don't want to remember this. We don't want to talk about this. We want to pretend like this didn't happen, and not even in a malicious way, but because people don't like talking about
In
and
a
thinking about
privileged way.
yeah, because people don't like talking about unpleasant things.
Mm-hmm.
People don't like talking about racism. They don't like talking about sexism. They don't like talking about, queerphobia. They don't like talking about ageism or ableism. And so we push those uncomfortable topics to the side. And when that happens and something gets up in your face and says, no, no, we need to have this uncomfortable conversation, folks often react very negatively, not even necessarily because they genuinely believe, oh, this isn't a problem that needs to be addressed, or I don't want you to talk about it. It's just, I don't want to hear it because it makes me sad or angry or uncomfortable, and I don't have the time, I don't have the energy, and therefore I cannot have the interest. And then, so they're like, I don't want it around me. It makes me feel bad. I don't want it around me.
And I think when we limit access to accessibility, when we limit access to those materials, it puts it to a point where it's a conversation that can't be had because we don't have the vocabulary for it anymore. If
Mhm.
people aren't consuming media that involves these topics, then we won't know how to have dialogue about these topics. We don't know what's comfortable, what's safe to say, and what is something that we should just write about in our journal.
Very much, exactly. Like I said, if we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it. So whether it is a terrible book about awful things by a bad person, or whether it is an uncomfortable book about terrible things by someone who was hurt, they both need to be on the shelf because you need both perspectives. Like, if you are going to have Mein Kampf by Hitler on the shelf for historical purposes, you must also have things like Night by Elie Wiesel.
Absolutely.
You must. You have to. And that's why, like, it's our job to show different perspectives and to make those perspectives available to you. But that's also why we celebrate all of the failed challenges and the reversed bannings and things like that during Banned Books Week, because let me tell you, like I said, it's weird to think that this is still happening in 2021, but I mean, just recently, people have tried to challenge, like, The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie.
I didn't know that.
To Kill a Mockingbird was challenged again this year.
Oh my gosh.
Of Mice and Men by John
No.
Steinbeck. Yep. The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas.
No.
Very popular book, of course. And again, one of those about like uncomfortable
Very
conversations.
excellent book. Yeah.
Really excellent book. But of course, it made them feel uncomfortable and they didn't like what it discussed. And then again, there are some that you can understand, like The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. That's one that's been challenged many, many times. It's a great book, a must read, but makes people uncomfortable. So you get why they fight it, even if you don't agree with it. But then there's others like George by Alex Gino. It's just, it not reflecting the values of our community, quote unquote, was why it was challenged.
Then
like,
don't read it.
Just don't read it. Just don't read it. And that's what censorship is always about, is, that's people trying to control the material that's available to other people, because then that makes their environment comfortable when they don't have to deal with conflict and with other people, I guess, what's the best way to say it? You don't want your lifestyle that makes you comfortable to be challenged. And so to a lot of people, it's often important not just that this uncomfortable material is not in your face, but you don't want it around you and quote unquote in your community, which we all know like what that phrase is kind of code word for, not in my town sort of thing.
Yeah.
Because it influences other people to be comfortable with it, or to start thinking and talking and having a dialogue about the stuff that's making you uncomfortable, and then goodness forbid, you might get dragged into it. You might be exposed to it. So, like, because I don't like this, I don't want other people to have access to it, because then they may talk about it where I can hear, and that counts as being in my face.
I just think it's interesting, though, because in real life, whenever you're almost in an argument with someone, like, that you don't agree with the things that they say, if they pull out something that sounds very educated, at least for me personally, that argument's over, like, I'm not going to fight with you because you clearly know what you're talking about, what you believe. So there's no reason for anyone to be convincing each other otherwise. I think a lot of our arguments come from when you're not educated about your standpoint.
Right.
So even if it's a book that I don't agree with, as long as it's being checked out and read, that's a lot better than not reading.
Exactly. And part of educating yourself so that you can have those conversations and defend your viewpoint, whatever it is, involves reading the material. Because even if you disagree with something, you have to understand what that thing is and where the people who believe that or feel that or write these things are coming from, or how can you have a rational, logical, well put together argument that goes beyond this makes me feel bad. And emotional arguments can be okay, but emotional arguments should be saved for purely emotional matters. If you are trying to object to something on logical or rational grounds, emotion can be there, it can be present, but you also need to have logical and rational arguments in addition to the emotional arguments. It's not that emotional arguments don't matter, they do, but you have to have the full basket of all of your defenses put together, and the only way you're going to get that is you have to engage the content. So it's also important, and I think that that's a really good point. That's something a lot of people don't think about when your knee-jerk reaction is, "Ooh, that makes me upset. Ooh, I don't like that," is to put it away from ourselves, because that's what we do when something hurts us. We reject it and we put space between us. We distance ourselves from it because we avoid pain. We don't like things that challenge what makes us comfortable or that takes us out of our comfort zone. But it's important to you too, if you don't like something, that you have access to it so that you can look at it and you can really think long and hard about why you don't like it and how it makes you uncomfortable and how you can and should object to it when someone else brings it up around you or tries to expose you to it, or that it becomes some factor in your life. And you can't really say, like, another challenge book from this year was All American Boys by Jason Reynolds and Brendan Kiley. It was banned and challenged for profanity, drug use, and alcoholism because it was thought to promote anti-police views, to contain divisive topics, and, quote, to be too much of a sensitive matter right now. So imagine, so people were objecting to this book by saying, this just happened. Should we really be talking about this? And of course, there are any number of situations you can point to where you can say, we should have talked about that then. We need to still be talking about it. If not now, when do we have this conversation?
Absolutely.
So,
and Jason Reynolds is a YA author, or even juvenile sometimes, which means we're limiting access for our children. Like, not even saying that we don't want adults to be anti-police, but taking the story away from people that might not even have understood it when it happened.
Right.
They're trying to do reading on something that is very much going on in their world, and it's being taken away by their teachers, their parents. Like, it's a very hazardous, slippery slope.
I feel like that's an incredible example of privilege and censorship as well, because if you don't want to read something because you don't want to think about these very real events that are really occurring all the time around us, but like, sure, especially right now, publicly, how would you feel if you didn't have the choice?
Yeah. And that goes back to why it's important that even people who don't like something should still have it on the shelf, because when you limit the choices of your children, a lot of people do that because they think that they are trying to guide them down the right path. And what intellectual freedom is partly about, and what freedom of education is partly about, is if you disagree with something, and if you consider it your job to guide someone else down a path that you see as correct, then you should be engaging these uncomfortable materials, and you should then sit down and have a conversation about why you disagree with them. And that is more likely to influence someone than just not giving them the choice, because first of all, we've all been here. When you make something taboo, it just becomes more attractive.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Reverse psychology is a powerful force. It's right up there with like gravity and electromagnetism. It's one of the big ones. If you tell me not to do something, I have already done it 3 times before you finish that sentence, just to spite you, because that's also a powerful cosmic force. Spite is maybe that might be the strongest one. Powerful motivator. So, like, if you don't want me to do something, if you want me to agree that your perspective is correct, then you need to convince me And one of the ways that you can do that is by being willing to engage the material that you disagree with and then say, okay, I have read the book, and here's why I don't like it. I have read the book. Yes, I actually did. And this is why I think that I have an argument for why this author is wrong, or why it shouldn't have been presented this way, or, like why it was a bad story. Whether it is just an opinion, like I don't think pineapple goes on pizza, or whether it is a conviction, like that doesn't belong in my town, that doesn't belong in my community. Convince me, show me why, and step one of doing that is by actually giving the other perspective a chance, and because you can't truly reject something if you've never given it the opportunity. So even if you think that it's wrong for your community, you still should have it there so that way you can pick it up and have it in your hand and talk about why.
Yes, absolutely.
That's what matters. If you just say, that's not allowed here, you're not actually having a conversation. You're just being arbitrary. You're being scared, and you're not making a good, strong argument. So
I had an incredible, it was actually when I was in high school, an English teacher who taught part of a course based around how to devise a strong argument.
Mhm.
And the biggest piece of advice that she wanted all of us to take away was follow the why. She always said,
Mhm.
if there's somebody opposing an argument that you're making, if they ask you why on any point and you don't have a solid response, you don't know your argument.
Yeah. That's why I think in cartoons and in comedy, we often see the repeated joke of a child following an adult around going, why? And a lot of times the comedy is like the joke comes down to the adult has an answer and keeps explaining until eventually they get frustrated because the kid keeps saying why, and they say it one too many times, and finally the adult says, because I said so.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's what it comes down to, if that's the core of your argument, that everything else that you just explained, all the other whys that you addressed are based on, then you don't have a good argument. That's a good argument, I hope, for y'all to come up and engage with Banned Books Week with us here. And we're going to be celebrating it all month. I mean, technically, we celebrate the fight against censorship all year, every year, all day, every day.
As a public library, that is our job here.
That is our job.
The Library Bill of Rights.
Yeah, that's what we do. We'll put anything on the shelf. We don't care. Ask us for any book. But we hope that you will come up and celebrate very specifically with us during the month of September and beginning of October. Check out some of these books. And if you do, don't forget to stop by the front desk and get your picture taken, because we are putting up wanted posters for folks who are reading banned books. If we catch you reading a banned book, your face is going to go on a wanted poster. So, definitely stop by and participate in that. And keep an eye out, of course, for updates in October. We'll be back at the beginning of October. The first Atlanta here, we'll have a new blog entry for you. And then we will be doing the new staff picks, and we will make some announcements about that on social media, on the website, and so forth. So come by and engage those, and we will be back at the beginning of October with more news and updates for you, including about whether or not we will be having programming. So fingers crossed, keep your ear to the ground, and we will see you next time. Thank you for joining us, and as always, I'm Morgan.
I'm Atlanta.
And I'm Emery.
And this has been The Reading Room, the podcast brought to you by your Rowan County Public Library.